Welcome to the Magnificast. This is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology and cultural theory, and obviously Christianity and leftist politics.
I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. But before we get any further, we want to remind everybody about the new Magnificast voicemail that I know is all saved in your contacts now. You're just waiting to push the call button. We're telling you, push it right now. Pause this podcast, go into your contacts list, and give us a ring. We made this Google Voice number, if you didn't hear last episode, where you can call us and leave a message, and we might play it on the podcast. At this point, we pretty much have to, because we don't have any yet. The phone number is 815-408-0745. So feel free to call us, ask us your pressing and intricate questions about leftism and Christianity. If you call in, like I said, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get on the next episode. So one more time, the number is 815-408-0745.
If you guys don't call, then Dean's mom will, and don't let that happen.
She's busy. She doesn't have time for that.
So please, just like if you could help out around the house a little bit and just call this number, it'd help.
Think of the moms.
Think of the moms. Okay, so this week on the Magnificast, we're talking with Amaryah Shaye, a graduate student at Vanderbilt. She wrote an essay recently that we're going to kind of talk over called Of Flesh and Spirit, Race, Reproduction, and Sexual Difference in the Turn to Paul. In this episode, we talk about all the important topics, pizza, mostly, why Paul is weird and Hagar is awesome, problems with universality, reconciliation, and the intersections of class, race, gender, reproductive labor, Dreher, and more. All of the things that you love about this podcast. Here they are.
It's required listening for PhD students in Dreher studies. What have you been up to? What are you up to? What do you do? Where do you live? What's exciting?
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student at Vanderbilt University, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. And right now I'm working on my dissertation proposal, which is kind of like an elaboration on the essay we read in some ways.
Cool.
So I've been working on that. I have a first draft finished, and I'm revising that and trying to finish it by the end of the week and making good progress. Also, I've just been hanging with friends, trying to read for fun a little bit, and playing music, trying to get my house in order.
Nice. What kind of music do you make?
I like to make a lot of different music. Sometimes I do more like beats kinds of stuff, so like electronic or hip hop influence kind of stuff. And then I also like am a singer-songwriter and do more like folky, like acoustic soul kind of things. So
that's awesome.
Just depends on how I feel.
Dean, what have you been doing, man?
I have been writing a ton. So I have this job as a journalist at this thing called America Magazine, run by the Jesuits, and it is a good job, but it keeps me very busy talking to people and looking things up. And actually, I just had an article published that I think is pretty cool about this place called the King's University in Alberta. And they're interesting because they're like a small Christian liberal arts school. And they, 10 years or so ago, decided to really take on board the case of this guy named Omar Khadr, who's the youngest person to ever be held in Guantanamo Bay. So it was just this like small cohort of, I don't know, evangelical Christians just decided that they were going to advocate for justice for this guy and they were really instrumental in getting him out of prison, and he's like a student at their university. And I don't know, that was a really weird and cool story to report on. So yeah, sometimes I have to write stories that I'm like not super into, but this one gave me a lot of hope. The Christians could do something good, and that was a good thing.
Super cool.
Yeah, that article is really cool. I've been passing it around to a lot of my colleagues over here, and they are excited by it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that like 3 other people have read it. That makes me feel good.
Yeah. Yeah, man, it's good. It's a good thing.
What about you, Matt? What have you been up to?
I have been coming to terms with my obscene course load next semester. I got too many classes that I'm teaching, and it is, I guess, a good problem to have. It's the job that I wanted, and it is the situation that I've gotten myself into, so I can only blame myself. So I've been like working through my syllabi and like setting them up and trying to design good courses that don't suck, and we'll see if I've done a good job. In light of that, of all of that, I ate a really good pizza today. So that's the best. Yeah, it was at this place called Pizza Head in St. Louis, and it was so good. I could eat it all the time if I had the opportunity, but I don't. Yeah, man. I'm all about pizza. It was the best pizza I've ever had.
Pizza's great.
So there. I know. It's the best. It's my favorite food.
Pizza is life. This is now a podcast about pizza and leftist politics.
Yeah, I'm actually writing my dissertation about pizza. Toward a theology of pizza.
Oh, man. Gaza Circle or something.
Something.
The univocity of ingredients superior to the analogy of pizza ingredients.
Mm-hmm. You know, but
the slice proceeds from the father to my mouth. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there has to be some joke about like the spirit always being underemphasized. Maybe it's like the tomato sauce or something.
Oh my god, that's exactly right.
So then Chicago deep dish style theological, you know, that school of theology really tries to emphasize the spirit by just dousing pizza in tomato sauce.
That's right.
Yeah, what's the what are the main like east west, you know, the Catholic Orthodox split, the first split in pizza making? I wonder. That's
New
a good
York style
topic.
versus Chicago style. I mean,
yeah, but which is which? Because then you have to have a variety of Protestant pizza offshoots, pizza heretics.
I think New York would definitely be the Latin tradition because it's like most well known, probably.
Well, if I could interject here
we're getting
for one
into
moment,
some serious debates now.
I believe that Catholicism and the Neapolitan pizza are actually one and the same. They come from the same geographical region. They have origins of colonialism in their ingredients. Tomatoes don't grow in Europe.
This just got deep. Wow. This is like the Council of Trent over here.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can talk competently about forever, it's probably pizza. So
yeah, we need to call a council, actually, like a formal pizza council.
This is important work.
Sounds good.
Good job.
All right, good. Well, now that we've already got that on the table, some friction right away, right up front. I don't know. It's not how we usually like to start this podcast, but here we are. Just getting it all on the table, if you will. Let's just move into chatting a little bit about some of your research, Amaryah. So we read an essay by Amaryah in the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory, or is it Culture and Religious Theory? I forget every time.
I think it's Cultural and Religious Theory.
Okay, I published some reviews on their website, and I still can't ever remember it. Will never remember. It's embarrassing on my CV, I'm sure. But anyway, the article is called "Of Flesh and Spirit: Race, Reproduction, and Sexual Difference in the Turn to Paul." It's a good title.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for allowing me to read it on this podcast. So usually we ask people to like give a kind of elevator pitch about the thing that they wrote when we have them here, which is easier when someone just writes like a 5-page article in a magazine, and a little harder when it's a real dense academic thing.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna ask you to do it unfairly.
All right.
If you had to give like an elevator pitch of this paper, what would you say?
This paper is essentially asking, why is the figure of the slave overlooked in the turn to Paul? The larger implications of the paper would be like in theology in general, political theology in general. But I look at Paul's use of the figure of Hagar in Galatians, and how right after Paul has made the proclamation that there's neither slave nor free, or Jew or Greek, or male or female, he goes into this allegory about Hagar and Sarah that really emphasizes that Hagar is a slave, and in fact is arguing in such a way that like Hagar's slaveness is essential to his argument working. So he's arguing basically that the children of the slave women will not inherit the kingdom of God, basically the promises of salvation from Christ, which come through come from the children of the free woman, which is Sarah. But basically what he's trying to do is establish like Gentile belonging through legitimizing their claims to being descendants of Abraham. And in order to do that, he uses the distinction between Hagar the slave and Sarah the free woman. So I look at that passage and Paul's use of that, and then I try to connect how he like distinguishes her slaveness as like the flesh and Sarah's freedom as the spirit, to kind of think about some contemporary issues in Black studies and racial capitalism, using Hortense Spillers and her work on this essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. That's really influential, but I think kind of helps critically locate I guess like some issues that are important to me. So my work kind of like, I used like Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness as a kind of like thematic companion to think about Hagar's position in Galatians, and then I kind of ended with using Hortense Spiller's critical work to kind of think about what's the connections between this kind of theological heritage of figuring the slave woman in distinction from the free woman, and the different claims to kinship that enables. That was a long elevator pitch, but
no, that was it was a good elevator
some
pitch,
elevator
though.
rides are long.
It's true. We went to the penthouse for that one.
This essay is really cool. I'm also not gonna lie that it's also kind of over my head. I'm not a theologian, so some of this is not like I don't directly understand it, but that's okay. What I've found really interesting about your essay is, I don't know, I guess kind of a connection it has to my own church's theology and ecclesiology. So that Galatians bit, the no Jew, no Greek thing, is kind of a big deal for a lot of Christians. It's especially a big deal for my tradition. I am involved in the Free Methodist Church, which is a really small branch of Methodism that, like, I don't know, basically no one knows about. And it's got a lot of its own problems for sure. But the one of the sort of like founding members of the denomination is this guy named B.T. Roberts. And B.T. Roberts has like this really strong affiliation with this verse because he was an abolitionist, and because he was also someone who was like really for the ordination of women. And so he uses this verse to like to justify those points that you should should be an abolitionist and you should ordain women. But the thing that is really interesting to me about this article is that you kind of complicate that a little bit, that the universality that he finds in this article, and that I think I find in this article too, has a little bit of a darker side to it, or like a I don't know. It's not a true universality, or there's a complication to that universality. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that gets at a really strong like thing that I'm trying to get across in the essay, which is like, I mean, part of what I'm trying to problematize, I think, is the kind of ways that this passage gets used as like a liberatory kind of moment, and like Paul is actually like on the side of like marginalized people or something.
He's the true communist, right?
Yeah, like he's bringing like some real like universal like free subjectivity or something. And I guess part of what I'm trying to highlight is how these kinds of claims to universalism often come at the expense of some people's flesh and blood, and like how those distinctions get overcome can actually create more problems than it solves. So, well, another big person in this essay I use is Daniel Boyarin, who is a Jewish scholar, and he's kind of like talking about how like Paul is in a kind of predicament because as a Jew, he's like trying to like avoid an exclusionary like position in relationship to the Gentiles, and is like trying to be more inclusive, which like is not necessarily a bad impulse, but the way he does it is to like end up kind of trying to overcome the fleshly particularity of Jewish people, and making that move through the figure of Hagar is really interesting to me, because it seems to suggest that Hagar's like slaveness and her Gentileness and her like being a woman are precisely the things that like exclude her from, and her children from, inheriting like being heirs to the promise. And so I guess it's like suggests to me, this like kind of underside to these like claims that people often make without thinking through how their claims are made, and like what is, I guess, like who is kind of not thought about in how those claims are made. So it's just like an assumed thing that it's a liberatory claim, but when you kind of look at it closely, this Gentile slave woman is like actually her condition as a slave, her literal condition as a slave is like required to be maintained in order for the allegory to work. And so it's really interesting you brought up this guy who's an abolitionist, because like a part of my like somebody, like I've researched some abolitionist literature, and like a lot of their rhetoric is actually really racist, and like a lot of their like legitimizations for abolition are actually pretty racist. So there's this guy like Benjamin Rush, who's a founding father, and he's like an abolitionist, and he's like thinks that blackness is a form of leprosy and is like a skin disease that needs to be cured by like trying to find ways to like whiten black skin. And so he's like ties it to this like Christian universal vision of like salvation and civilization as like his legitimation for abolition. So it's like just interesting to me, I think, the ways that this kind of white abolitionist language and desire is also coupled with some really problematic shit too.
Yeah, it is for sure. I don't know all the particularities of B.T. Roberts' abolitionism, but I can't imagine it's completely blameless. At the very least, you know, it's a good point to bring up, though. That's it's a good insight that people who are abolitionists are not. I don't know, always the best.
I think it's well, I mean, I guess it's like rather than like turning it into maybe kind of a moral claim, it's more like there's a kind of tendency, I think, of white people, even people trying to be like on the right side of history or something, to kind of presume that like there's a problem with blackness that needs to be overcome rather than like a problem with whiteness that needs to be overcome. And so like the way of like getting around black oppression or something is to make black people like white people. And I think part of what I'm trying to point out is like how that universalizing kind of tendency like requires trying to make this like marked flesh of the slave or something into the free, but actually it's kind of clear that the distinction, or that the overcoming doesn't really work, or that the distinction still exists in some sense, literally. And so that literal distinction actually problematizes the kind of metaphorical or allegorical, like, freedom that's being claimed.
So one thing I think was really interesting about your article, Amaryah, is how you really use the figure of Hagar to challenge Paul as like a like she finds this liberating moment alone, like in the wilderness, excluded from that really weird universalizing story in history. It's it's interesting. As I was reading it, I was like, whoa, I wonder, there's all this stuff about this return to Paul and Paul being the Ur-revolutionary or whatever. But meanwhile, there's all these other characters in the Bible who find like their own kind of liberating moments and potential in ways that just get like very overlooked, it seems to me. Yeah, could you say something more about that? Like, what would it mean to, I don't know, think from like the position of somebody like Hagar? Like, what would that look like in terms of theology? How would you do that in terms of challenging, trends that are happening right now? Is that kind of, do I have you completely wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one of the questions my dissertation is trying to ask. In part, like, I think you have to go through a kind of problematizing of the kind of figures like Paul in Christian theology in order to get to a place where you can then like look at what else is happening in the text and like who from the underside is not being attended to. And I feel like that's one of the like amazing things about Dolores Williams' book, Sisters in the Wilderness, which I don't know if y'all have read, but that would be it's a really well written, but also like not jargon laden kind of like theological text. And what she does that I kind of try to repeat here in a different way is like she looks at the Hagar story in Genesis and she rereads. I mean, I guess it's like actually not thought of as the Hagar story in Genesis when she reads it, right? It's thought of like as the story of Abraham and Sarah and like this like kind of covenant between Abraham and God being established. But she goes back and rereads it and like looks at the figure of Hagar and talks about the figure of Hagar as a route to Black women's condition in contemporary society. And what she's not trying to do is be like, Hagar is a Black woman, as much as she's trying to show that the structural position that Hagar inhabits is like the same kind of structural position that Black women inhabit in our contemporary society. So she talks about issues of like surrogacy, and for Dolores Williams, surrogacy is like this concept basically how, I mean, I guess The Handmaid's Tale is really popular right now, but
that's true. I watched it.
Like the kind of like the ways basically that handmaids are used as surrogate laborers for these women in The Handmaid's Tale, right? In the biblical narrative, that's what happens to Hagar. Sarah can't get pregnant, and so she tells Abraham to use Hagar to get pregnant. And so Hagar, the slave, gets pregnant, has this kid, Ishmael. But basically what Dolores Williams does with her concept of surrogacy is talk about the kinds of like substitution at work and the kind of labor that goes into surrogacy. So like Hagar's reproductive labor is taken advantage of. Also she's like just raped as a slave, but it's like not legible as a rape because of her position as a slave. Basically, Dolores Williams just calls attention to all the different kinds of labor that come along with surrogacy and uses that to point to Black women's labor during slavery as surrogates in white people's households or in the fields. The ways that like disabled them from taking care of their own families in order to take care of white families, but then also how after slavery, right, a lot of Black women's labor has happened in the domestic sphere, and that's been like really overlooked. And I would extend that, like one way that I try to extend that today is just like thinking about reproductive justice in general, and like how Black women's wombs are kind of always under attack by the state through like criminalization, through the murder of Black children, through like imprisoning Black mothers. So like there's all kinds of ways in which that kind of like reproductive labor is still like occurring today. So I think one of the things that like gets highlighted when you attend to these kind of stories from the underside is like actually a lot of things become more politically explicit in some ways and like more politically relevant. And so I think a lot of the spiritualizing tendencies of a figure like Paul in the ways that like, I don't know, a lot of people try to rate him as a materialist, but I just don't find that super convincing, I guess. and I think that there's like these other figures provide a way more materialist kind of like in to connecting scripture to politics.
Yeah, that you bring up labor in the Register of Reproductive Labor is it's really interesting, and it makes me think of like a different writer. This is broadly a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, and when people mention the words reproductive labor around me, I always think about this really great Marxist feminist named Silvia Federici. And like in the 60s, she was a part of a movement called wages for housework, and a different social context for sure. But I remember reading that as like a young MA student and being like completely struck that like domestic labor and reproductive labor is like real labor and real work, and it's like stupid not to recognize those things. But I don't know, because of like intersecting like lines of like domination, it's like easy to not think of those things as real work. But that's obviously a misstep, I guess. So that you draw that out with Hagar, I found that like pretty illuminating for me, or at least a way to rethink this story that I guess I've probably heard a bazillion times in church, but never really thought very hard about.
Amaryah cites Silvia Federici toward the end of the essay.
Oh, really?
Footnote. Just kind of as a...
Yeah, why didn't you read me more closely,
really
Matt?
cool
I'm really offended. You didn't read the footnotes?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't read the footnote. That's so dumb.
Just kidding.
I don't say that to be a tattletale on you, Matt. Though I'll take that byproduct. Just going to pocket that for later. 1 point, me. 0 points, Matt.
That's fair.
But anyway, that being said, I wonder, Amaryah, like, could you talk a little bit more about that, specifically like reproductive labor and, I don't know, leftism is a really weird thing, especially right now in the United States and elsewhere, but I don't know, like we've been tracking certain conversations on the left for a while on this podcast, and sometimes it's cool, and then other times it's like, it feels like people aren't actually thinking that hard about what's happening or how they should proceed or anything like that. And this question of reproductive labor is like a really weird thing that Marxists have attended to in interesting ways, like Silvia Federici. And I appreciate that you bring that out here, because it's not only that like Hagar is an underlooked at figure in the Bible or whatever, but even that issue of reproductive labor is underlooked at just in the left in general. And that connection is really explicit the way you pull it out. So could you just say something about that? Like, what would it mean for leftists and Christians to take that seriously, like you kind of suggest here?
Part of what I'm trying to do here is think the questions of like economy and labor in a different way. And I think like one of the fights on the left right now is like like class and economics versus like identity politics or something. And I like that makes me so furious, because I'm just like this is a weird staging of the problem if you just like open your eyes to like histories of racial capitalism, and also like histories of like Black radical like scholarship, like this idea that somehow like these identities are a distraction from class relations is, I just think, kind of offensive. And also, I guess, like, to me it seems to like ignore like precisely how we get to the kind of economy that we have today. Like, what kind of labor formations like did capitalism depend on to develop into what we have today? Who is like most at risk for certain kinds of like precarity, and like how is precarity distributed along like racial lines? So part of my intentions in this essay was just, excuse me, like trying to use, or not use, but like show how like Hagar's situation illuminates something about like how you can't think these things separately. Like, you have to think them together in order to understand how economy operates. And so to me, like, economy does not like somehow symbolize some kind of like class first analysis. To me, economy is also about like structures of relationships in order to like determine how certain distributions of goods happen. And so, like, to me, looking at the position of the slave within this like familial economy like highlights certain things about like how the slave is figured as a threat, for instance, to this line of inheritance. Once Sarah and Abraham have a child together, Ishmael and Hagar have to get cast out because Ishmael is a threat to Isaac's inheritance. And so like already you have this like kind of like conflict or antagonism that's like rooted in not just like an economic inheritance, but also like a kind of kinship, like inheritance of like a kinship line. And so we see that later in Galatians, right? Like Hagar's been disinherited from the line of Abraham in Paul's thought, and so like that removes certain like claims of like rights or legitimacy from her and her children or whatever. And something I've been thinking a lot about is how like kinship claims and the legitimacy that provides like operates today in our contemporary racial like economy. If we think about things like whose like grievances are able to be registered by the state, for instance, right? Like Black people just being like Black Lives Matter or something like is often extremely infuriating to a lot of white people's lives, because Black people don't have a claim of legitimacy to like the rights of citizenship in this country. And because of that, like certain goods are withheld from Black people's lives. Things like police not shooting you for no reason, right? So
that is
like
good.
There's like, so I think that there's like a range of things that economy, like looking at economic relations, can cover, and not just like the financial aspects, even though I think like class relations and the financial aspects are important. But I think it's interesting, like if we think about policing as like policing of like a way of protecting private property, it's interesting to think about like police brutality against Black people and criminalization against Black people in that way as like a way of like foreclosing a certain kind of like inheritance of goods, whether those are public or private, to Black communities, and like actively dispossessing those communities. And that's something we saw like in Ferguson. The Department of Justice went there and was like, well, they're just like finding these people like crazy and extorting money through them in unjust ways through how they're policing and criminalize these people. So like all this stuff is tied up with like, yeah, to me it just like doesn't make sense as an analysis to try to like talk about class or economics without thinking about the racial structure that animates those relations.
So on this topic, I guess, of economics versus identity politics, or people who like only can consider one at one time or something like that. I mean, like, that's a super prominent discussion on the left. I don't know. It was a conversation we had a few episodes ago with a different guy, and it was a completely fine conversation. But I was wondering, like, in terms of like the spirit and flesh dichotomy you draw in your paper, I wonder if we could even think of that conversation along those same terms. Like, is the ability to only think of economics and class, like, can we equate that with only thinking of spirit in some way and not thinking about the bodily particularities of people? Because that to me makes a lot of sense. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Is there something analogous going on between spirit and only thinking of class?
That's interesting. I mean, I think the ways that it comes up in conversation, class is thought to be something that like transcends these like other markers, right? And so like class solidarity is this like transcendent kind of like relation that like all people are like brought into, the 99% or something, right? That, and so I think in often how it's narrated, it's like used that way a lot, actually.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna double down on this possibly bad opinion right now. That because Mario, the way you said that too, I guess, strengthened my particular viewpoint in this moment. That that like in creating solidarity across class lines internationally, it does have that sort of sense of like disembodied community to it, where like I don't know, people of the proletarian of any country is like, you know, all joined together in the fact that they're the proletarian, but it does neglect, I don't know, all of the different dynamics that play out in any given geographical space and cultural space. But maybe that's like, I guess that's probably why like Zizek and Badiou or whatever find that type of thinking so appealing in Paul. I don't know, man.
Yeah.
That's a weird direction maybe.
As far as like the spirit and in class being the spirit is like part of like what I'm trying to do with this essay, but also my work in general, is be like, we don't have to actually talk about these relationships this way, and like we don't actually have to talk about class in this way. We don't have to talk about like race or gender or sexuality or identity politics in the way that Hillary Clinton flowchart that like was completely nonsensical did. And I mean, I understand. Here's the thing, like I get the, like, I guess I don't want to say fear of identity politics because it's kind of racist, but like there are legitimate critiques of identity politics, right? And like a lot of like Black radical folks and other like radical folks of color have like made those same like made critiques of identity politics that also like recognize that whiteness is an identity and whiteness has an identity politics too, and like often these like class first critiques of identity politics forget that and don't understand like how whiteness is maybe affecting how they narrate and think about class relations and how they like posit it in some kind of opposition to identity politics. And so yeah, I guess part of what I'm trying to establish is that like we can actually talk a lot about like economy and like class relations and like not think that has like nothing to do with like structural positions that are raced and gendered, kind of like formed on like the distinctions that those different positions like enable between something like the slave and the free.
Yeah, could you say something about, okay, if we, so here's the worry, I think, that a lot of, I'm gonna channel the people that all three of us
come
are
at me, bro.
Fans of, I think. Yeah, alright, here I am, putting on my my best, like, Jacobin voice.
Oh, God.
Okay, So,
Oh wow! I'll have
that's
to
my
leave
Jacobin
this
voice,
podcast.
and that's as long as it can be.
Oh, no!
That's triggering for me.
I'm very sorry. Okay, I'm gonna back right off that real quick. So I think what a lot of those folks are worried about though is like, hey, whoa, if we don't have class, if that's not the thing, how are we gonna build solidarity? We gotta have a lot of people to shut this thing down. There's more of us than there are them. It's just a big numbers game, and you gotta make sure you get all the numbers straight. And all these other conversations are, making those numbers smaller and smaller, and you can't amass the kind of force that you would need to shut that stuff down. So that's like the worry, and there's a vague, like, commonsensical appeal to it, right? Where the narrative that's told is like, well, it's just as simple as getting enough people in the right place at the right time to like be friends, and that's the revolution. Like everybody's a friend at the same time, and that's it. So could you speak a little bit to that, like? How does that logic operate? Do you think it extends from this kind of Pauline universalism that you're going after here? And then also, like, what would we do? This is such a dumb question. I feel so bad asking anyone. But, like, what would we do if we didn't have recourse to those kinds of solidarity building narratives that have, won revolutions in the past? Like, what are alternative ways of building that kind of resistance that you would need?
Yeah. Well, I guess to me, like, solidarity is not a concept that only has been used in relationship to class. So I think a lot about, like, revolutionary black people who, like, called for solidarity with, like, black people's liberation struggles. Yeah, like, Palestinian solidarity or something. Like, to me, it's like, the notion of like class solidarity being what will bring everyone together, to me, will always prioritize white people's, like, solidarity with a certain class of white people over solidarity with black people. And I guess my question is not so much like, why are you pushing class solidarity, as much as like, why is it that when it comes to black solidarity, like, black people get sacrificed or something by these, like, movements that claim to be about building solidarity, but then will kind of sacrifice black people to the wolves if that, like, maintains class solidarity or something. And so I guess it's like, to me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually. And, like, actually one way to, like, strengthen solidarity across classes is to, like, deal with that kind of racism that can inhibit some of the solidarity that folks are trying to build.
Maybe I could, like, come at it also in another direction and saying, if maybe there's a weird Pauline legacy to the left, like if there's a Pauline universality that motivates some of these conversations, what would it mean to have, like, a Hegarian left? Like, what is the kind of what's the kind of strength that she finds in contrast to the kinship narratives that you criticize rightly with respect to, like, Abraham and Sarah? What does that kind of strength lend to, like, leftist struggles?
You're trying to make me just reveal my cool turn in my dissertation on this show. No. No.
You can protect your intellectual property if you want to, 100%, and that's not like a dig.
No, I mean, I guess part of it too is, like, I actually, like, don't have an answer for that yet, and I think, like,
that's totally fair.
something that I'm trying to, like, think through in my work is, like, what does it mean to try to, like, follow in Hagar's legacy instead of, like, a Pauline legacy? And I mean, I think part of it to me is kind of resisting, like, narratives of belonging and, like, kinship and, like, reconciliation that are used to, that, like, pretend to kind of be really liberative or freeing, but actually like depend upon somebody's flesh and blood being kind of sacrificed in order for that freedom to exist. So like part of a Hegelian legacy would question the value of freedom as it's given through these narratives of belonging and kinship and family, and like ponder like what is this freedom built on, and like who's paying the cost of this freedom, and like how is this inheritance dependent on somebody else's disinheritance. So I think maybe part of it would be just to like start asking different questions instead of assuming the value of freedom or the like value of inheriting this promise. Like, yeah, I think it requires us to think about those relations of power a little differently.
Yeah, it's I think a good direction to go in the conversation. So you said, I mean, that's a point well taken, that there are bodily costs to the rhetoric of freedom that I think are used pretty readily. I know something I hear a lot play out on my campus is like lots of talk about reconciliation, and right, it's like a word that is liberative. It's like a good rhetorical turn, I suppose. But you said that there's right, the cost of bodies bound up with that. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I wrote a blog series actually for Women in Theology a few years ago that was like about like refusing to reconcile, or like refusing reconciliation. Part of it is like, well, I grew up in like evangelical, like Black Southern Baptist church, and every year we did these terrible like pulpit swap things where like one year my dad was the pastor, so one year my dad would go to preach at this white church, and like our congregation would go over there, and then we'd like worship together and have some snacks after and have very polite conversation, and like, wow, this is what heaven's gonna look like, is like something that was said all the time. And then the next year they would come to our church, and you know, the white pastor would like love preaching in front of Black people, and he was like, oh, you know, why, you know, my congregation's like, Pastor, why don't you preach like this at our church? And I'm like, how come y'all don't respond the way they do here? And so there's... It's
pretty cool that you guys stopped racism like that.
Yeah, it was really great. And it was great how much racism we stopped. We stopped a huge amount of racism. We were the best at stopping racism. Yeah, so that's like part of like the context I grew up in. But then my dad was just like really active in like racial reconciliation conversations, and like would had like a conference on racial reconciliation that he like organized every year for several years. So I was like very inundated with like racial reconciliation as a part of the gospel. And then I got to college and I was like, well, white people don't give a fuck. And like really what it is like I came to see that like what racial reconciliation functions as is a way of like removing responsibility from white people for like being accountable for the legacy of white supremacy and its like continued existence today. And so there's this idea that like we can have like some kind of cultural exchange, and that it's supposed to like somehow like repair like the material dispossessions and like the violence against Black people's flesh and blood, and the like years people have like lost in prison. Like somehow like just being nice to each other is supposed to like fix that. And like that's just ridiculous. But actually like a lot of people have a theology that basically is like this kind of wishful magical thinking that like, oh, Jesus unites us all, like our Christian identity should be before any racial identity or anything. But really it's just like that's actually a way of like obscuring the kinds of relations of power that continue to exist between people. And so yeah, I hate reconciliation. I think it should die. You guys can like use.
You make a strong case, though. It's pretty good, actually. I think that articulation of it is.
Yeah, you guys can use that as the pull quote for this. I hate reconciliation.
Yeah, we will. It'll be in the tiny letter, but in big letters in the tiny letter. It's interesting you say that because I live in Canada, and reconciliation is like a very big word here because they had a big Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Indigenous people that ended a few years ago. And it's a real struggle for Indigenous people, I think, especially to even figure out what that is supposed to mean, like how they're supposed to mobilize that word politically. Like I was just talking with a couple of people for an article that I'm writing now on Indigenous people reacting to it's Canada's 150th birthday this year, and they're all basically just like, what? How are we supposed to deal with this? Like 150 years celebrating like how we've been colonized and like not like completely disrespected, etc. So yeah, it's hard because the reconciliation is like the thing that Justin Trudeau comes out and is like, yeah, we're all gonna reconcile, right? That's the thing we're all working towards.
Reconcile this year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they're all just like, what? Not like you don't even know what the problem is. Like you can't reconcile. Like we're not even on the same page. And it's like that language of reconciliation bars a lot of Canada from ever even coming to terms with the fact that there was an issue.
Yeah, I mean it's one thing I point out in this blog series that I wrote is like the difference between interpersonal and structural like antagonisms or conflict. So in some ways, like, is reconciliation maybe possible between an individual indigenous person and like an individual like white settler? Like totally not going to like foreclose that or like say that people can't have some kind of healthy relationship that seriously wrestles with and deals with the different kinds of relationships of power that come from those different social positions. But that's not the same thing as like a structural kind of reconciliation, and that would actually require like a deep transformation of the way things operate. Mostly because like I think a lot of people think like, oh, well, we can give you XYZ, we can give you like affirmative action or something, or we can just like, and as far as the like US and black people go, like, we'll free you from slavery. Like that's basically like the reconciliation.
And you're reconciled.
Like so now we're all good. Like but that doesn't actually think about like one, the dispossession that occurred, but also like how you would like maintain equitable relations if like the way you've been operating historically has been so inequitable. Like you actually have to like structurally change things in order to like reproduce a more just society. So like part of it is like the thing about reconciliation is like you can't even get to that conversation about like how can we like put in place and like reproduce more just conditions. It's kind of just like, well, we acknowledge that this thing happened, even though we still aren't like very clear on like why you're so mad in the first place, but like we're all good now. Yeah, like totally cool. Like I'm gonna go home and like have some, you know, soul food with my black friend, and like it's all good. Reconciliation.
To me, whenever people start talking about reconciliation, it does just always seem like seeking forgiveness from like what they're trying to set up to be like a 0 point, like a completely objective position where it's just like, well, we're sorry or whatever, and only on our terms though, never on the
right. I mean, it's
terms.
It's a very controlled discourse. It's never going to produce anything good because it's always on white people's terms, and so like already forecloses like the self-determination of like black people or indigenous people in like deciding like what the terms are for reconciliation. And I feel like most Black or Indigenous folks wouldn't even like want to talk about reconciliation. They want to talk about like reparation and like having the harms repaired in some kind of way. But what's interesting is like what often happens is like white people will just talk about like the incalculable like debt they owe or something, or how like the harm was of such a great magnitude that it like can't be repaid, and use that as a way to like not have to give any kind of repair for the things that happened. Like, oh, this was such a tragedy in our nation's history, and like it can never be made up for, and we can only like get along now, and that's what's gonna like heal these wounds. And it's just like, what if you like, you know, burn down my house and then I'm like, I'm really sorry I did that. If we can just get along now, like I think that can heal.
Listen, I can't afford to buy you a new house, so can we just like forget about it?
It's just like, what? That doesn't solve the situation. That now I'm homeless.
It just seems so silly that it's like, well, it's just such a big number. Like I can't count that high. Well, it's like, well, no, we could probably figure it out.
And like there's all kinds of like folks who are like, actually, we've calculated, and you know, with inflation, this is like how much money like slaves created for the economy. So like, let's totally figure out a way to like distribute that. Yeah. So like when people, I mean, make those arguments, it's just actually really revealing about the fact that like they just don't care and don't want to do it. And to me, I would just like rather people like just be honest about the fact that they don't care and don't want to do it than like be like, oh, you know, it was such a tragic thing that happened and we really, really have work to do, but we just need to talk to each other more, you know, just bridge those differences, and like that's what's gonna fix this.
Yeah, it's like more insulting, I guess, than anything else.
Yeah, I feel like I go on rants a lot about white liberals these days, but honestly, like, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't lying when he was talking about white liberals being the worst, because I'm just like, if you're like racist and you just let me know, I can avoid you, but if you're like a white liberal, they're always like trying to like be your friend so they can feel better about themselves, and it's just like, dude, just like give it up.
In terms of like reconciliation and sort of like the, I don't know, the not good at all the like kind of job it does, I to me it seems like it's like almost a mirror of the evangelical like prayer forgiveness, like where you like just pray to Jesus really quick, like, please, oh my God,
yeah,
I've done so many dumb things, please forgive me or whatever. And it's like
that's a really good,
it's like the same sort of
that
logic.
works, Matt. I don't know what you're talking about. That works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I hope so.
Yeah, I've had like 5 virginities. It's like it works so well.
Well, it just seems like the same sort of logic though, where you're making like a really quick like
yeah,
like pithy plea for forgiveness, where I don't know, those things seem very similar. Sorry, what else are we going to talk about?
No, I mean, I think part of the point I was trying to make at the end of the essay though is like I think James Cone is someone who experienced a lot of criticisms in like the late 90s and early to mid 2000s, I guess. And like to me, like James Cone embodies like a completely non-reconciliatory like Black theology, and like I am very like invested in exploring the possibilities of that. But there are like some Black theologians who like put more value on reconciliation. So like J.D. Otis Roberts, who wrote around the same time James Cone is writing, has a book about like Black theology and like reconciliation, and it's like basically arguing that reconciliation is like this valuable thing, and I mean, I feel like I don't know, there are like ways that I think assert like Christian belonging becomes a substitute for like racial belonging, or there's a way like that a lot of people narrate like race as like divisive, or like racial divisions is something that like Christianity needs to overcome. And to me, like the narration of like racism as like a like harmful fragmentation or like division of like identities or something, like is just like really weird, because I'm just like, actually there's like a particular group that's responsible for like making this problem. So it's like weird to just be like, we all are so fragmented and divided from each other, and like even like, yeah. So I just like, I do think that they're like, you know, to me, like being a Black theologian doesn't mean that you aren't also susceptible to a certain kind of Christian logic of reconciliation or redemption. And I think that like is something to be aware of in how we try to respond to white supremacy.
I was trying to think of like some like really snappy good question that we could ask, or conversation or something to like cap this whole baby off. It's not what you do with babies, but that's what we're gonna do.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Smooth.
Thank you.
Did you have a good one?
No, I said I was just trying. I didn't succeed. It's just.
Oh, I see.
This is always the worst part of the podcast, is like thinking of a way to bring things together. Yeah, exactly. But by the way,
here's a question.
Amaryah, like all this nonsense is just gonna get cut out, so it's not gonna be like this embarrassing thing of like, oh no, what do we say?
Oh, great!
Like,
I'm so glad
some of the nonsense will get cut out. Some of it's actually very funny.
So glad people won't know how much I hated being.
Yeah, I'm also glad.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I think that this podcast is great, and I actually listen to you guys.
What? No.
And so I totally do.
She
I listened to the Rod Dreher episode, and that one was really funny. And I listened to the Vincent Lloyd one. I think I've listened to a couple other ones, but I don't remember the titles.
This is unrelated, but it's like been bugging me.
Oh, I listened to the Christian anarchism one because I spent a lot of time with Christian anarchists.
Oh, nice.
So.
That's cool. I'm impressed that you must have very good hearing to have listened to it. So good for you.
Yeah, it's so quiet.
Jacques Ellul, something.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
all I heard was Jacques Ellul. No, I'm just.
Yeah. This is unrelated, but did you guys by any chance see? There was a article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about Tommy Curry today. Did you guys see that?
I did, but I haven't read it yet.
Oh, well, it's basically like 100 more reasons to like not like Rod Dreher. So just if you
that guy is actually the worst.
Yeah, it's like quick preview of the article. He basically is criticizing a philosophy professor at Texas A&M who is like a person of color for suggesting that like I don't know, like black people should like arm themselves and defend themselves if necessary. And then like Rod Dreher's like that's too far. You're being crazy. And then Tommy Curry, this like academic philosophy professor at Texas A&M, he like gets death threats. And then after Rod Dreher hears about his death threats, Rod Dreher's like, man, he should arm himself and like really protect his family. All right.
Rod, the Confederacy was #actually good Dreher. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly the person I'm talking about right there. Yeah.
He's such an upstanding guy. I love that
he's
guy.
Standing up. You can't sit down.
He just tells the truth like it.
Most days he's on his feet.
He's got that standing desk. He's ready to go.
Standing desk. Oh my gosh, I would love to see Rod Dreher in his natural habitat of his like home office.
He's like tiny basement over
like
one light bulb with no no lampshade or anything, just standing at his desk.
And also like one of those exercise balls that you have to balance on to strengthen your core.
Mm-hmm.
I know he has.
He
one.
definitely has one of those.
Just riding to like the rhythm of an incessant leak. That's what I imagine.
Me too. maybe here's a question we can wrap things up on then, I guess. So Christianity has like some problems with the way it thinks through reconciliation, for sure. But is there anything, I guess this is probably way too broad, but is there anything within Christianity that we can find that might direct us in like a right direction in terms of not reconciliation, but like, I don't know, something like material that can be done? I'm just wondering, like, is there a hope for Christianity in terms of like justice in the world?
Well, I don't like talking about hope, because I think it's another way that sometimes people deflect from like the actual difficulties and like violences and like structural inequities that like persist. And so like I don't really think that there's a lot to like find hope. Well, I guess there's a lot of hope in Christianity, but I think it should all like end too. And I guess like to me, like what's interesting about theological materials, I guess, is that they can kind of be used against themselves in some way. Like I think about like James Cone and his second book, A Black Theology of Liberation, which is a systematic theology. He's like extremely well versed in like systematic theology, especially Barthian theology and Tillichian theology. So he uses Karl Barth and like Paul Tillich in order to like kind of like I wouldn't say like to make his claims, but like he kind of uses them to like set the stage upon which he makes a lot of his theological interventions. And then because they're so central to theology, I think actually that means a lot of his claims like hit at the heart of the problem with theology and the heart of Christianity. And to me, like, that's like something that I try to learn from and how I think about theology, which is like trying to know really well the ins and outs of a lot of white theology in order to like make a more incisive intervention into it, and in order to like basically, I don't know, kind of confuse it with the blackness of black theology. And so for me, like what's possible to do with like Christianity or theology in a way that's like not awful. I think that depends on whether it can do justice to black life and black death. And I think a theology that's like striving to do that is going to operate on very different terms than like theology as it's given. And I think a theology that's trying to do justice to black life and black death will probably have to like rethink theology instead of understanding it in terms of like trying to find this like systematic coherence. Will actually encounter a lot of impasses in its speech about God, and like actually like have a lot of like difficulties making sense in some ways, and like it can't run from confronting those incoherences, but really has to like attend to like what they mean and like what violence has produced those incoherences and those like silences theologically.
Yeah, you really perform all of that, it seems to me, in the article that we read. I just couldn't help but think, like, as we were reading all these seemingly commonsensical but actually very complex thoughts about the legacy of Christianity, because I was like, oh, yeah, Paul says this thing and then immediately says this other thing, which is something I'd never thought about. I mean, I don't read the Bible very well or very often, quite frankly, because I go to a church that reads it for me. Like, I don't, I've never made the connection that, like, right after the universalizing verse, you get this very particular verse. And the fact that you reach back into Hagar in her story to kind of make your point and say, hey, listen, this is another thing that happens in this book, and it's really important, and there are other ways to think from it and to think about other texts in light of it. It just seems like exactly that, using it against itself and trying to stir the waters. And I don't know, I really appreciated that. So as a testament to what you were just saying, I think I picked that up.
That's good to hear. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. Thanks again to our guest, Amaryah Shaye, who came and talked about her very cool essay. You can find it linked on our blog and probably on the Tiny Letter as well. This is a good time to remind you that we have a Tiny Letter. It's a newsletter, so you can sign up for that on our website and get some additional material about Christianity and left and whatever Dean and I are up to in any given week. Okay, cool. So as usual, you can support us on Patreon, like us on Twitter, like us on Facebook. You don't like people on Twitter. You do that. That's Facebook stuff. Okay, we'll do that. Write us an iTunes review, retweet us, share us with your mom, with your friends, whatever. Do that good stuff. All right, thanks for listening.
There we'll swim with all creation, never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up, you keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up, well, you keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Besides, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes.